I want to start out with something kind of fun. What animal do you think your personality is most like?
Oh goodness. This answer has changed over the course of my life. Um,
So I guess in this season,
in this season, I don't know. What animal is my personality most like? Um, I'm trying to think of maybe like a little bit like a sort of like a dog that's not a puppy, but not like like an adult old dog yet. So it can still have like intense bursts of energy, but then the rest of life is just kind of like do 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 do. Here we are.
I guess
So
about a young dog then, but not a puppy.
yeah, so we're out of the puppy years, but not into like I'm an old wizened dog. I still am like, a 3-year-old dog or something.
What would you
That's sort
like
of
to look like if you were a dog? Like, do you want to be a specific breed?
Oh, well, my favorite breed of dog is the Bernese Mountain Dog. I think they're beautiful and majestic, and I love them so much. So I will say the Bernese Mountain Dog because they're a herding dog, but they're a big herding dog. And they're sort of protective, but they're not as intense as a German Shepherd or anything like that. They're a nice kind of mid-range dog, kind of like a Newfoundland in the way that they're built, but their pattern is so beautiful.
They are really pretty. They're super
Yeah.
cute too. Is
Oh yeah.
there a time period in history you'd live in if not now? So if you couldn't live in the current time, where would you go?
Oh man, I have thought about this question a lot as a history major. Um, the time period that I'm most really interested in is the 19th century in the United States, just because so much happens in that century in the United States. But I don't know which end of the century I would like to live on because there's so much happening the entire century. It's absolutely insane. And the country's changing so much. And particularly for women, there's a really they hold a really fascinating place in society in that century. And I would be, you know, I would probably be a peasant in another century. I'm not gonna lie, but I think I would enjoy the 19th century.
You would be a
Uh,
peasant in the 19th century?
well, I don't. Peasant is perhaps an exaggeration, hyperbole. But I don't think that looking at like my family lineage, we're not a super well off family in the 19th century. So it's sort of like lower middle class.
Oh, did you go all the way back, like Ancestry.com or something?
My oldest sister actually traced us all the way back to, I think it's Switzerland in 900 AD. And apparently, I
Ah,
just found this out literally Labor Day weekend when I went home to visit my parents, that we are related quite distantly at this point to the first Duke of Normandy.
oh my goodness, that's
So
very.
maybe that era would be interesting.
What
But
what when you're talking about what women in that time period hold an interesting place, what do you mean?
oh, well, because after the American Revolution, there's a really strong emphasis among a lot of the founding generation. I mean, to say that the founding fathers all agreed about something is always wrong because they rarely agreed about anything. But one of the emphasis that comes out of the founding era is this recognition that a republic only flourishes with a virtuous citizenry. Coupled with that recognition was the affirmation that women have a massive role in making virtuous citizens. So and in the American context, what that ended up doing in a lot of political theory is saying that women have a political role, even if they're not voting. They have a very important political position in the country. And so it's really important for women to be educated. And in the 19th century, you see this massive boom by the end of the century in women's colleges in particular, and just a growth in um, the recognition of their voice and role, even if it's not political rights in the sense like you don't have the right to vote in the United States till 1920, of course. And I wouldn't wish back before the right to vote. But I think it's
Hmm.
really interesting the progression of American women's political involvement in the 19th century. So you have that element, like the Republican virtuous mother kind of ideal. And then, which encompasses more than just like a wife in the home, it also has to do with their role in sort of broader society that has to do with the protection of the home, which is why during the Second Great Awakening in the middle, I think the 1830s leading up to the Civil War, the major driving force behind like the hundreds of social change programs that happened in that era were driven by women, like mental institution reform, prison reform, all these different things. Why? Because American theorists, or just like the American ethos at the time, argued that those all had to do with protecting the home. So like the flourishing of society had to do with the protection of the home, which is with the main priority of women, even if they were unmarried women, if that makes sense. And I think that's a really interesting development, just to see how their involvement into the political life of the nation was couched in terms of this protection of the home. So that's like the first half of the century. Then something really interesting happens because of abolition. So tons of women are really involved in the abolition movement in the North, and I think some in the South. I couldn't speak to that with a ton of authority. I mean, you have Harriet Beecher Stowe and all these different things. But what happens is, as they're getting more and more involved in abolition, they are encountering a ton of discrimination. So they're this huge, massive driving force in the abolition movement, and they're not allowed to speak in certain places, in certain times and situations. And women start to draw this parallel between the situation of enslaved persons in the United States and parts of the situation of American women. It's like the liberty that we're arguing for in abolition, this whole political freedom, personhood acknowledgement for enslaved persons, is not actually possessed by
Mm.
American women, because in these particular areas, we're not allowed to speak or be involved. And that is actually what starts to kick off. You get the Seneca Falls Convention. Oh, I'm going to forget her name. Anyway, all the women involved with that, the women's rights movement, women's liberation. Well, I guess that's the later term, but the women's rights movement, first wave feminism, because of that. So that's just so fascinating. And that all takes off in the middle of the century. And then at the end of the century, you have the women's temperance movement, which is like built into all of this. A lot of the women's temperance, they're part of the reason why women didn't get the right to vote, because they didn't want it. But they have this massive political impact. But because of the women's temperance movement, we get the amendment to the Constitution that eliminates alcohol consumption. So I think that's just fascinating, like the progression of political involvement of women in that century. And also you just have all like the literary developments. I mean,
Mm.
Louise May Alcott, and I cannot remember any other women's names right now, but there's just a lot happening intellectually and institutionally with women's place in American society in that time period.
What do you think is hard about, and this speaking for yourself, because I know it's different for many people, but what do you think is hard about being a woman now?
Hmm. Um, I don't know exactly if I can speak to like, womankind. Speaking of women in the West, I think, or like the American context, I think feminism is a bit in crisis, and the Barbie movie actually speaks to that a lot. I think it's a really interesting film. From everyone I've talked to, I must confess, I haven't seen it yet. I'm going to see it on Sunday. But I think that feminism is in this moment of really intense crisis, partially because the third wave feminism has sort of devolved into this fourth wave of feminism, which is like womanhood is whatever you want it to be, sort of however you want to express it, which means that it's nothing, right? If it can be anything you want it to be, it doesn't have a definition. And that's extremely disorienting because, like, Billie Eilish's song from the Barbie movie, I think encapsulates that angst that comes from that, because it's the whole question is, what was I made for? I want to be happy, but I cannot be because I do not know what I was made for.
Mm.
That's a profound critique of what's like American women today,
Yeah.
in the sense of that's probably one of the hardest things, is that we have this sort of identity crisis. What does it mean to be a woman? And you cannot explain what it means to be a woman unless you can say what a woman is made for. And for a long time now, we have made that an anathema thing in like mainstream culture. You can be whatever. A woman is made for whatever she wants to be. And then you add to that the pressure of sort of a lot of the LGBTQ and transgender issues, where I think the interesting things that a lot of feminists are pointing out is that there's this huge push to have men who are transgender welcomed into women's spaces, but there's not like a push to have women who are transgender men like pushed into those male masculine spaces. So that has created this sort of lopsided pressure on the question, what is a woman? Because that movement, I think, and I don't want to polemicize it at all, because I think there's a lot of nuance to that conversation, which ought to be had and needs to be included. But it's it's raised a lot of pressure on that question. It's like, can a woman really be whatever we say that it is? Or is there something that women actually are? Is there a definition? And is there a way to live out what, in fact, we were made for? I really think that that's the biggest issue. And it plays out in all sorts of different ways in women wrestling with whether to have children, when to have children, if they don't want to have kids, relationships, career. Like it touches everything because, I mean, Aristotle would argue like the final cause, the purpose for which you are made is the most important cause. And
Hmm.
I don't think culturally speaking, we don't have the language, the moral language to express that. Um,
How do you see it affecting you personally?
oh gosh.
Like, what do you find as Emma, as a woman, hard?
Um, I think one of the things that I find challenging right now is thinking through, okay, I'm 24, I'll be 25 next year. I'm moving towards sort of higher education and the direction of a career and working and all these different things. It's the big question of like, well, what does family life look like if that's something that exists at all? Um, and how do I navigate moving forward confidently into something that I'm equipped for and I enjoy doing and I think is interesting, while also holding this desire for having a home and having children and staying in one place and choosing that place to be the place that I give myself to,
Mm.
which I think for me is really associated with family in a lot of ways, because the place that you choose to stay, you stay there because like your people are there. And then you commit to cultivating that place, to giving yourself to that place. Otherwise, like right now, the thing that keeps me here is because I'm in school here and a lot of my good friends are here. So there is like a community, there is a human element of keeping me here.
Mm.
But in the long term, um, if it's just me alone, like bumping through life, there's no like strong, compelling reason for me to stay in Percival versus going to, I don't know, the Czech Republic or Germany or like hopping around. And there is a part of me that's like, oh yes, I want to go out and travel and do all these interesting things. And then there's a part of me like no, I want to be in a place and to help heal that place and tend to that place and care for that place. And I don't want to do that alone. And I think right now I'm wrestling with the truth that I don't actually have to do that alone because I am a member of the body of Christ. And they are my earthly family in a very real sense, which is why the Bible elevates singleness so highly, because you do not have to be married and have children to fulfill a meaningful and role in society as a
Mm.
single person because you are part of the body of Christ. So that's kind of what I'm like, I feel all of these different tensions pulling, also my own selfishness, and there's lots of things going on. But I think that that particular question of like, how do you move forward towards a career, towards work that you find compelling and worthwhile and that you are good at and want to contribute, and yet have this really deep
Mm.
desire for being a wife and being a mom, and like work and motherhood are not mutually exclusive, I don't think at all. But um it requires a sacrifice, you cannot have both 100%. And the other part of that is like I cannot really control whether any of that actually ends up happening. So I think that for me is part of the big question. So the whole identity crisis thing that I was talking about earlier with like broader American women, I went through a ton of that in high school and up to my sophomore year in college. And then that really shifted for me because of my studies. And it is much less of a point of anxiety or angst. Now it's a question of how do I fulfill this thing that I'm created to do rather than what am I created to do?
So what would you say you're created to do?
I think that women are created to be strength bringers. So it's a different kind of strength than the masculine strength, obviously. Well, I suppose not obviously, but it's like the best analogy I've come up for it is the walls of a city are a different kind of strength than the army that goes out of the city to attack the enemy. But both of them are crucial for the well-being and the health of the culture
Mm.
that exists inside that city, those city walls. And I think that feminine strength is more analogous to the walls of a city than it is to the army that goes out of the city to attack or conquer, whatever outgoing armies do. And that fundamentally, that's women's role in society, is to be strength bringers. And I think that that can manifest in all sorts of different ways. And it goes back, the reason I came up with that phrase, the strength bringer, is because that's what the biblical word that's often translated help meet means, azer. It means to bring strength.
Mm.
And when I realized, that was a really key turning point for me, because when I realized that that's what that means, and that that name is given to Eve before Eve is given to Adam. And if you think of Adam as the archetypal man and Eve as the archetypal woman, what God is really, part of what God is getting at in that Genesis creation narrative is womankind and mankind. And as they are distinct, the thing that he says is distinct about woman is that she is this strength bringer,
Mm.
right? Which is so cool, because if that's true of just women as women, then women never need to be married or have children to be fulfilled as women. They can fulfill their created role by being a strength bringer to men, yes, and to other women and to kids. Like, they can do all of that and still be single, which I think is really remarkable. If that's just simply true of the feminine nature, I don't know the language there, like that's what we're created to do. And you can do that in your workplace, and you can do that in your home, you can do that in your church, you can do that in all sorts of different contexts. And I know that's kind of like, practically speaking, Emma, what does that look like? And that's what I'm trying to break out now. How do I fulfill that calling? What does it look like to bring strength as a woman, um, in my workplace, in my church, in my community?
And
Um,
you're saying that the Hebrew word for helpmate is means strength bearer, and that in scripture, referring to Genesis, when it talks about how God created Eve out of Adam, you're saying that she was named before she was brought to Adam, and that's how you're um, basically tying that knot on the idea of a woman's identity apart from the man.
right. And apart from the man, in the sense of not married to the man.
Mhm.
Because so Eve is called Eve when Adam sees her. So there's that word isha in Hebrew for woman is like, that comes after um, Eve and Adam are, oh gosh, like he names her Eve after they're like, they have the whole, he sees her and says the poem, which I think is really beautiful. And they're like married in the biblical account. But God says, there's no one like you, Adam. I will find a helpmeet suitable to you. And that phrase, suitable to you, is like you in kind. And that's what Eve is. She's like Adam in kind. She's a human being.
Mm.
And the particular way that God described her was as the strength bringer,
Mm.
which that word primarily, and I haven't done an exhaustive study of the word azer in the sense of like looked at every single instance, but primarily in the Old Testament, whenever that word appears, it is used to reference two things: God, so like that, the phrase in the Psalm where it says, I look unto the hills, where does my help come from?
Mm.
My help comes from the Lord. The word for help there is azer. That's how it's used, as sort of like the relieving strength that comes in when you are at your wit's end or you are in need of aid.
Mm.
And then it's also used in a military context for, like, for example, if you've watched The Lord of the Rings or read The Lord of the Rings, when Minas Tirith is under siege by the hordes of Mordor, and the Rohirrim pop up over the hill at the last minute to bring their help, that's how the word is used elsewhere in the Bible. It's like the army that comes to relieve the besieged city, or the one who is sort of being overwhelmed, which I think is really, like, that's such a magnificent understanding of why God makes women.
Hmm.
And it recognizes that men and women are different. And it recognizes that because they are different, they have need of each other, right? Because different, to say that two human beings are different is to say that one has something that the other does not,
Hmm.
which means that you, Danielle, have something that I do not have, which means that I need you for that thing. So it's the same between men and women. Men need women because women are different than men, and women need men, full stop, because men are different than women. And that's not in the needing of the sense of, oh, I need to find a man to marry to complete me. But like, mankind and womankind need each other for a flourishing culture, like to fulfill the cultural mandate. It cannot be just Adam. It
Hmm.
was given to Adam and Eve together because they are suitable for one another. But I think it's so cool.
It is. When you're talking about the crisis you went through, sort of an internal crisis in high school through sophomore year, can you explain what that was and how you experienced it, and then how you came to this more peaceful resolution of like, okay, well, this is what I'm made for. This is encouraging. And now it's just simply walking with the Lord through my journey of finding out how that's going to work out.
Right. Um, well, I think in high school and probably a bit in middle school earlier on, I growing up, I always thought that femininity was so magnificent. Like, it was just glorious. I loved um that idea. And I love when I encountered women who were just beautiful, not in the sense of like, oh my goodness, that woman is so attractive, but in the sense of, when I'm with this person, I feel whole and well because they are whole and well, and they are giving that out to the people around them. Like, I think that with like my encounters with women who are like that was just, this is incredible. So I had on one side a really high view of like, oh, to be a woman is such a beautiful thing. At the same time, I was like, I'm none of those things. I'm not good enough to like live up to this glorious thing that is womanhood. So I sort of like pushed it to the side, which is
Mm.
why in high school, I never wore dresses. I never did a lot of like the classically feminine things because I was like, well, I can't do them well enough to honor what it means to be a woman. So I might as well not try at all. So I'm just going to like stay in this kind of androgynous zone.
Why did
Um,
you feel like you didn't have those things?
oh, that, I mean, it ties into a lot of things leading up to my salvation, which happened after I graduated high school. So prior to that, I had a really, really strong sense of my own sin and a recognition of my inability to do anything about it. And it's not because someone was going, I wasn't in a community that was like, oh, you sinful wretch, you must do all these things to atone for you. Like, I was not my context at all. Um, but I was like, oh, sinful wretch that I am.
Hmm.
People are applauding this like because I'm smart and I can do all these different things, and I they see that and applaud that. But I know how wretched I am internally. And no matter how hard I tried, I was just never able to overcome that. Because I like, you're just not good enough to earn your salvation. That's just true. You cannot earn your salvation. It's impossible. So when you try to do that, when you try to justify your existence through your own effort, at least you always fail. You always fail
Hmm.
because the only thing that can justify your existence is God. That's the only thing that justifies human existence. And when humans try to take that place, it only leads to Babel and the corruption that we see like writ large all across scripture. And for me, in my own context, it led to misery and
Mhm.
just a sense of complete worthlessness. Like there's nothing good about me at all. So it was just like this overawing sense of my own inadequacy. Even as I was succeeding at things, I was like, but they're not, they're not, they're not justifying me. Like this
Mhm.
isn't enough to make my life worth anything, you know?
Yeah.
So I think it was a subset of that sort of place where I was internally, where I was like, everything is terrible about me. Like there's nothing beautiful about me. And I'm not, when I use that word beauty, I'm not primarily speaking about like physical appearance. It's
Right.
a much deeper idea. So that was, I think that all played into like the whole femininity thing, where I'm like, I'm not graceful enough. I'm not kind enough. And I always thought I was super harsh. And in high school, I was pretty harsh. So, I wasn't too far off the mark. So that was like, I think that for me, as I've looked back, I was not self-conscious of a lot of this while it was going on. So I didn't think to myself, oh, I'm not good enough to be a woman. But everything in my life like followed from that presupposition. That was unspoken, if that makes sense.
Mm.
So like looking back, I can say, oh, it's because of da 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 da. But at the time, I was just really unhappy. Um,
What I know this is so random, just pausing it. I remember our conversation when we were talking about autobiographies and names. Unspoken supposition.
hey, that's a good one.
It's a good one, right? Should think
I'll have to
about
write that
that.
one down. Because we live our lives so much about out of those unspoken beliefs.
Yep.
The
Anyway,
unspoken,
sorry, keep going. I was like, ooh.
boom. My biography coming to you in 2060. Unspoken supposition. I don't know why I only gave myself 61 years of life, but oh well. Um,
That's when you'll write it. That's how I took it.
oh, there we go. That's good. um, so that was sort of where I was in high school. I graduated high school. I came to Christ, so I was saved, and then I went to college.
Hmm.
And which I can tell that story if you're interested in hearing that. I've told you that like a bazillion times. So, but that was a big turning point in my life. Lots changed. And another big turning point in my life, really closely affected that, was sophomore spring. And it wasn't because of COVID, which is funny because it was all happening during COVID. But you actually were a big part of this, which is so interesting because I was taking History of Women in America with Dr. Rob Spinney, who I love. And that class had started making me ask myself for the first time ever, what does it mean that I'm a woman and not a man? Like, how is that actually different?
Hmm.
Because that's basically the question the class is asking. Because like history classes just look at events through lenses. So an economic lens, a military lens, and this one was women's experiences in America from 1620 onward, or perhaps a little early. My memory's a little foggy at this point. So that was a beginning point of all this. It was like, well, what does it actually mean to be a woman? And that's when I started investigating Genesis. So like, well, I'm a believer. I think the Bible is authoritative in all these things. So what does the Bible have to say about this? The big scene where woman is created probably matters. And I must confess, I had grown up hating the phrase help meet because I found it demeaning and minimizing. And I was like, I don't want to
Hmm.
be a little help meet. I want to be the leader. And I was one of those like kids who's like, well spoken and kind of bold. And so often was in that position in the different games and stuff. And I was like, well, I don't like this at all. So I'm just gonna ignore it for the most part. Anywho, so that was where the whole Azair thing comes into play. I was like, oh my gosh, this is actually not limiting at all. And it's massively expansive and incredible. So that all happened before COVID. And then in the middle of that, my little revelation about just like, oh, women are strength bringers. What does that mean? Because I was also seeing that play out in American history, because that's the Puritan view of women. And so it's how the Puritans like constructed their societies and why they honor women so much, unlike a lot of the medieval church that got influenced by Aristotle's argument that women are just deformed men. Puritans didn't believe that. And instead, they were like, no, women are created in the image of God, just like men. Yet they are different, and we ought to honor that difference and glorify it and use it to the advantage of the whole culture. It sounds like novel thought. Incredible. Um, I'm just rambling at this point. But in the middle of all this, we had a conversation. You came into my room, we were talking. I don't remember how we got to this point. We were eating Thai food. And all of a sudden you just go, Emma, do you want to get married? And I was like, what a weird question. I mean, maybe like in my late 20s, perhaps. I don't know. Yeah, who can say? Do you remember this?
Yes, yeah, I do.
And you were like, in typical, just like very forthright fashion, go, I don't think that that's true at all. I think you really do want to get married and you're just afraid of it. And I was like,
I do remember that.
you remember that? I was like,
Yeah.
excuse me. How dare you? Like, that is
We're still
not the case.
friends.
I don't think
Here's
I
the
said
thing,
that.
this is the lesson learned, folks, is that you could speak truth into people's lives, hopefully in love. Maybe I could have been more loving. I don't remember how I said it.
No, you were
And we're
fine.
still friends.
Exactly.
Possible.
It is possible, and it had a huge impact on my life. So thank you. So anyway, I was affronted at the time, though. And I was like, what? No, that can't be it. And just planted a seed. Then COVID happened, and I went home. And this class is still going on this whole time, History of Women in America. And we're trotting through history. Really remarkable study. Highly recommend looking at American history through that lens. Then, boom, we get to the 60s. Lots goes crazy in the 60s with the women's liberation movement and second wave feminism. No, that's third wave. Don't quote me on that. Anyway, one of the things that goes out the window right away after that is marriage. It gets really like bombarded and majorly denigrated by that movement, because marriage is perceived as a sort of constricting, destructive institution for women in particular by the women's liberation movement by and large. Which, I mean, to be fair, they're reacting against a lot of corruptions in American society that had come out of the 1950s. But that is a little sidebar. I will not go into that. Anyway, so that all happens. We get there and I go, wow, that's really interesting. What do I think about marriage? Which brought me back to mind your comments. And one day after class, I Zoom finished, all the other students logged off, and I said, hey, Dr. Spinney, do you mind if I ask you a question? And I go, what do you think are the prerequisites to marriage? And he was like, wow, you just really save the easy questions for the end, don't you? Well, just curious what you think. For those who don't know Dr. Spinney, he was also a pastor and is just like one of the wisest men that I've ever met. So it's not as weird as it sounds to ask a professor that. And the first thing he said is, he goes, Emma, the first thing you need to know that frames this whole discussion for you who are in Jesus Christ is that if you are in Jesus Christ, you are part of God's grand conspiracy of kindness to do you good. So if you get married, it's because it's God's intention to do you good through that. If you do not get married, it is also God's intention to do you good. You are no less part of his conspiracy of kindness, whether or not those two things happen. And he said a lot of other good things. That's what stuck with me the most, because I was sitting there and it blew my mind, because it made me realize, oh my word, I don't think God intends to do my good in this area of my life, which is why I always say, maybe. I don't know. I deny that desire entirely because I don't want to be disappointed by not getting the thing that I finally admit, oh my goodness, I really want this. And then I was like, well, why do I think that God doesn't intend my good in this area? I mean, for heaven's sake, I've trusted him with my immortal soul. Like, seems like there's a little bit of a discrepancy here. And this was just like our Father's such a gracious way of getting at a really deep identity issue in me. Because as I thought about it more and more, I was like, oh my goodness, I don't think that I'm good enough to get married. Like, I don't think I have what it's cut out to participate in this beautiful, profound gift that God has given humanity, that is marriage. So I had, again, a really high view of this thing and a really low view of myself. It's like, I'm not good enough for that thing. And the minute I said that out loud in the context of both my own salvation and in what Dr. Spinney had said, I almost laughed, because I was like, well, that's just not true. Like, That is patently false, because whether or not I get married is not dependent on me if it's a gift from God.
Mm,
It's not dependent on my worthiness to receive it.
mm,
It's dependent on God's will to give it,
mm,
which takes all of the pressure off of me to be good enough. It and puts all of the responsibility on God to decide, will you give me this gift or will you give me another gift? And both of those things are good.
mm,
I was like, wow, that's incredible. Like, I don't have to worry about this and be anxious about it. Do I think about it still? And do I wrestle with that idea and that desire? Yes, but I do it in such a different way now, because all of a sudden I realized it's a gift, which led into the next year realizing, oh my goodness, my entire identity, not just like this aspect of it, is a gift of God. Like, my womanhood is a gift of God. It's not for me to earn being a woman, it's to receive the gift that has been given. Like, I just have that gift because he chose to create me, not as a man, but as a woman. That's a gift. And like, the glory of my life is to receive that gift and to live out that gift in gratitude. Like, that's such a different perspective to, I have to be good enough to earn the right to be a woman. I have to be good enough to earn the right to marry. Like, I have to justify myself. Like, no, absolutely not. God justified my existence by creating me. That's the end of the matter. That's why I exist, because God himself chose to make me for his good pleasure. Crazy. Like, that's just, whenever I remember that and recall that to my mind, most of the anxiety in my life goes away, because I don't have to earn God's favor. He just he just gives it, not because I deserve it, but because he wills it, which is just, anyway, it's glorious. I think that answered most of your question.
yes, wonderful. It's such a cool reminder, especially remembering. I think now in the time we live, it's easy to, like you said, there's an identity crisis, don't know who you are,
Mm.
and being reminded whether you're a man or a woman that you were created in the image of God and thus exist. And that's why you exist, is for him, to have a relationship with him. I mean, that is very meaningful. That just doesn't go away with circumstances or how bad or good you are at something. So it's a really powerful reminder. Well, I'm going to ask you one more question. What would you say? Because I know for me personally, and I've been talking to a lot of young women about this, is there is a lot of angst, like you said, about being a good woman, in the sense of not good even in a moral sense, but good in the sense of, okay, I want to make sure I make the meals for my husband. I want to make sure I do really well in my work. I want to make sure I'm able to pursue my interests at the same time. I want to be able to keep a really good home, and I want to do all these things extremely well. And I feel like I see all these other ladies on social media or in my life who are doing it so much better than me. And so there is that feeling of inadequacy, similar to what you were saying, like, well, I'm just not good enough at this to do this well. And even for believers, it does come down to, okay, now I'm starting to identify myself apart from Christ and what I can do.
Mm.
How would you, or like even talking about yourself, like how do you encourage your heart and speak to your soul in moments like that?
Hmm. Um, it's a very good question. It's one that comes up, particularly like, it just comes up often, because we want to live well. Like, we want to live well. And the way that I encourage myself, I think a good example is in Titus. I love the book of Titus. And a lot of people are like, oh, it's just about church polity. And I'm like, no, it's about so much more than that. Because the central turning point of Titus is this idea where he goes on this like long rant about, as Paul does, about how terrible humanity is, basically. And then he's writing to a Christian church, right? And then he goes, and so too were you. And it's like, ugh, any sense of self-righteousness is eviscerated by the phrase, such were you. And you're like, that's true. Such was I. And the turning point is, but then the loving kindness of God showed itself to you. And the word loving kindness there used is um, a Greek word. I can't remember it, so I apologize for those who know Greek. That means philet, like it's love for humanity. That's it's particular kind of love. His philanthropy, basically. But the philanthropy of God intervened essentially.
Mhm.
And it lays out the gospel. It's like, and so he sent Jesus Christ. He sent the good one, the holy one, the beautiful one to us to live, die, and die for the atonement of our sins. So that phrase, such were you, is a past tense phrase because of the action of Christ in his life and death and resurrection. And then there's another turn. So like that's true. And it's like the goodness of God, the goodness, yeah, that's the phrase. The goodness and loving kindness of God appeared, and you're saved through Christ. And then it says, so go, like basically, I'm not quoting, go forth and do good because that this thing has happened.
Mhm.
And the word for good there, when it's both speaking of Christ and speaking of us, is the Greek word for kalos. It's used all throughout the New Testament, and it's primarily translated as good, but it can also have a sense of the meaning beautiful in Greek because those ideas are so intricately bound together. So essentially, what that passage is saying is the beautiful one, Jesus, came into our ugliness, such were you, gave himself to us and for us so that we are now beautiful and called to lead beautiful lives. That is the gospel. The beautiful one gave himself for ugliness and made it beautiful through his self-giving and is continually making it beautiful. And we are invited to join into that beautification. Go and do good. That is the Christian imperative. But that imperative can only be true because such were you is past tense, right? Because of the work of Jesus Christ. So whenever I'm like, oh, woe is me, I'm such a terrible person. I did this stupid thing. I made this bad decision. I have this vice that's come up in my life that I can't seem to kick. I am bereft, whatever that happens to be. Um, I'm just not good at this. I'm terrible at meal prepping. I'm so bad at blah, 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 blah. I always come back to my soul and I go, but the goodness and loving kindness of God has been shown to me. That is true. Because of that, I am both beloved and made beautiful.
Mhm.
Like those are simply true because of Jesus Christ. And so then my prayer goes from, oh, woe is me, to Father, help me to live as the person you recreated me in Christ to be. Like, help me to do beautiful things, to do good things that you've called me to, because you've made me new, and that's your promise that you will sanctify me. Like that phrase in Philippians where it says, "Work out your salvation with fear and trembling." That the sentiment behind that is live out your salvation in awe, because God is at work in you, both to will and to work for His good pleasure. Live your life in awe that God is working in you. And you, yes, you have to live, like you have to be the one who's doing good, but you can only be the one doing good because God is being good to you, like, and has been good to you. So that's what I remind myself of. I'm like, okay, yes, failure, 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 failure. Okay, beloved, redeemed, beautiful one, whom the God of the universe has called his own. Okay, Lord, help me to walk in your ways. Like the cry of the psalmist, search me and know me. And if there's any wicked way in me, then lead me in the way of everlasting. Like it's God acting in our response. So that's what I do. I have to just remind myself of the gospel. And sometimes I have to have people whack me over the head basically with the gospel and be like, Emma, what are you doing? You have forgotten the first things. Like, remember this. That's it has to be the lodestar of our lives. The cornerstone is that remembrance that the goodness and loving kindness of God appeared in the person of Jesus Christ, and we've been saved. And I think that a lot of times Christians kind of think that the gospel is primarily an evangelical, like what is the word I'm looking for? Evangelizing tool. Like people who don't know Christ need to hear the gospel. True, yes, but we do too, because there is a war going on with the flesh, and the world is tempting, and there's all sorts of, like, the name Satan means the accuser. We're constantly being accused by ourselves and by just all these different things. The answer to that accusation is, I don't justify my life, Christ does. That's the answer to the accusation.
Hmm.
And that proclamation then allows us to live a beautiful life. So it's not a justification for, like, okay, my life is justified by Christ. Now I can, I don't know, have mojitos at midday and not do anything. That's not the biblical account at all. It's like, no, now you can do good, right? So it's like growing into that reality is our joy, and that's the whole purpose of our lives, is to love Jesus more. And in loving him more and seeing him more, we're changed. And that change that comes upon us manifests, and we love other people more, and we live out our lives better, and we're more responsible, and we're more mature, and, like, we're more virtuous. We live well because we are little Christ. Christ is living in us, you know? I don't know. But we have to remember that. Otherwise, it becomes works really easily. If it's not, like, if we don't remember that it is God who acted first,
Hmm.
and now we can act because he acted.